Okay, so to attach your first coil, before we even start rolling a coil, I want to go over a few of the things that you're going to want to have. You're going to want to have a knife with you. You're going to want to have slip, and I keep my slip really watery. It has clay in it, but it's super watery, and I find this is easier to work with than really thick pasty slip. So if you get a little bucket of slip and it is full of, or is really thick, add some water to it and then mix it up to make some liquid slip. You're gonna want clay. You wanna keep the coil soft as you are rolling, so you wanna keep the clay in a bag. Don't let it sit out on your table next to your work. My recommendation is get a bag of clay, keep it for your table, and then put back what you don't use in the bin at the end of the period, but keep it as you're working. That way the clay stays wet while you're working. If your clay is really wet and really sticky like this clay is, so you'll see when I take it out, it's really sticky. My fingers are sticking to it. You're gonna need to wedge it a little bit before you start. So just wedge what you need. You don't have to wedge it a ton. Your goal here is to just get rid of the stickiness so that it's not so soft and so sticky. So I'm just gonna wedge it a little bit. Now when I go to touch it, my fingers aren't sticking to it anymore. It's not leaving any marks. It's good to go. So to roll a coil, if you try to roll a coil with this lump of clay, you'll struggle and it will become uneven. So what you're gonna need to do before you even start is you want to form the clay in your hand to already look like a coil. So that you start with a shape that looks more like a log, less like a random lumpy bump. If your work surface is really dry, it will take a lot of the water out of the clay, and we don't want that. So if it's really dry, you might want to spritz it a little bit with water, not too much so that your coil slides across, but just enough so that it's not stealing water from it. If anything, it might give it a little bit of water. So I start with one hand. As soon as I can fit both hands on, I start to roll the coil. The thing you're focusing on in rolling the coil is that it is even. Don't worry if it comes out a little oval and it's not perfectly round. That's not as important as perfectly even. You don't want to have a coil that has, and I'll show you what, you don't want to have a coil that is really skinny in some parts. This is not a good coil. It's thick here, it's skinny here, thick here. That's gonna make for uneven walls. Cracking could happen as you work. A number of things can happen. You can add clay to make up for some thinness, but it's better to not have that mistake made in the first place. So if that happens, start again. Again, round is great, but not 100% necessary. What is necessary is an even thickness. So I'm just gonna roll this coil out. I use more or less my whole hands. So from here to the tips of my fingers, and I'm just gonna roll the coil out. If I do start to notice that it's getting a little bit flat, I can kind of tap it a little bit to get it back into the round. The thicker, the fatter your coils, the heavier your piece is gonna be. Too thin of coils and you're going to have a very fragile, easy to crack or possibly more susceptible to cracks. So you want not a super thick coil, not a super thin coil. You want somewhere in the middle, and I will show you what that looks like. So that's a pretty good size coil. I'm gonna bring over my base piece and I'm gonna make sure that this fits around it, and it certainly does. So I'm gonna get rid of some excess. Again, I don't want my clay to dry out, so I'm just wetting my surface. If your canvas mat is really wet, you don't need to do that. I'm gonna bring my banding wheel over. You're gonna want that serrated rib, so the rib that has all the little teeth on it. And you're going to want to score around the bottom of your surface. As you're scoring, dip it in a little bit of slip just to make it have some water on it so that when you go to attach, you're attaching with wet clay. If your piece is really leather hard, you need to score aggressively and a slip will add more slip. If your piece is still on the soft side, which mine is, and my coil is definitely on the soft side, scoring so aggressively and adding a lot of slip isn't 100% necessary. So I'm just going to lightly run down the length of my coil. So this coil is long. You might think, oh, I made such a long coil, I can keep wrapping it around. It'll frustrate you. You will have uneven edges and you'll try and always play catch up. So my suggestion is, one time around, if the coil isn't big enough to fit all the way around, that's okay. You can add a little coil in, but don't try and layer on top of each other. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm just gonna cut through on an angle through both of them, and I'm gonna take off the excess. And that should give me somewhat of the right shape. I'm not going to attach that yet. I'm gonna start at one side and I'm going to compress it. So that means I'm gonna push on it to make it stay there a little bit better. I just want you guys to have some better light. So I'm going to compress it to make it really sit on there nicely before I start to smear it in. And usually through that process, what happens is the coil gets a little bit longer. So I'm just gonna cut through that again and get rid of any excess. Just gonna rip off a little bit. My excess clay gets scrunched back into a ball and put back into my bag as I'm doing this. So the next step is going to be to really get that coil attached. So I just go around and compress it. So I'm just kind of pinching it down. I haven't smeared anything into anything yet, so we can still see lines. The next step after it's attached, so it should be able to not come off, is I'm gonna use my finger and I'm just going to smear all the way around. We're gonna reinforce the base because it's the part that is prone to the most cracking with another coil, but I'm not gonna do that until the structure has been built up a little bit. So I'm just gonna smear all that in. And then I can use my finger to smooth it out. And I'm gonna do the same thing on the outside. I'm just gonna get my base and my seam to come together. This first coil is probably the most frustrating. As soon as you get a little bit of lift off of the ground, it becomes a little bit easier. I'm gonna go back and refine all of that in the future. So I'm not gonna worry about it too much. So at this point, I just go around. If anything kind of slumped over, I bring it back up. If anything's uneven, I kind of pinch it to evenness. Don't pinch too thin. The idea here is just for a general even thickness. All right. I'm going to show you how to build up in the next segment.